Good. Okay. I want to say a couple of words by way of introduction. I am Professor Taddeo. Some of you know me from History 236 or 429, the internship advisor, and I am the advisor for the History Undergraduate Association. So if any of you are new to the major minor, all you really have to do is attend one HUA event and you're pretty much a member. So some events coming up. On the 13th, we're going to be hosting another event on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then on the 18th, I think it was 30 to 12:30, we'll be having a social hour outside, weather permitting, and probably another trivia night. So we've got all sorts of great activities, social and academic. So we will see you at other events. All right, now the basis for today is Queen Elizabeth II's Royal Jubilee. She has been on the throne for 70 years. That is the longest reign in British history. And what does it mean? Why should we care? What's the larger historical context for it? How has Great Britain changed over the years, over the centuries? Both Dr. Barron and Dr. Rush will put that in perspective for us of how the monarchy has changed, and also the Empire and later the Commonwealth and the United Kingdom itself. So all of these things are relevant. This queen is sort of the last link to an imperial past. And so much remains to be seen what will happen moving forward after she dies and the throne is passed, of course, to her successor, Charles. So we're going to start, each of us talking just for a few minutes about our area of expertise and putting it in context. And then our fantastic moderator, former HUA President Jessica Mahoney, will pose some questions. And then we're going to open it up to all of you. If you have comments, anything you want to talk about for the Royal, questions. So thank you everyone for joining us. All right, Dr. Barron, I'm going to throw it over to you now.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Know why that's happening. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk about the 5 queens regnant, the 5 women who have been queens in their own right, who have had their own blood claim to the throne, not a regent or a husband or a son, not a queen consort, but queens regnant in their own right. And that would be Mary the First, who you see in the upper left, who was queen from 1553 to 1558. Then her sister Elizabeth the First, who's queen from 1558 to 1603. Then Queen Anne, who was queen from 1702 to 1714. And Victoria, who was queen from, Julie or Anne, help me, I'm going to get this wrong, 1837 to 1901. Is that right? Is that right? Can't hear you.
Muted. Yes, you passed my class.
Okay, great, good. And then the current Queen Elizabeth II, who's been on the throne since February of 1952. And these are all women who have encumbered a position that is by definition a male position. So something that's interesting to think about is what has that meant for each and all of these different women. So I'm not going to have a lot to say about Mary because she was only queen for 5 years. She was 35 years old when she came to the throne. She did get married and tried to have children, but she failed in that, and consequently she was succeeded on the throne by her younger sister, Elizabeth. 3 of the other 4, well, I never have these in the right order. Anyway, all of these women trace their lineage back to the so-called first Tudor king, Henry VII, who became king in 1485. And I've got family trees here just from James I, who succeeded Elizabeth in 1603, down to the current queen. And we're going to record this so you can look at these in some depth later, or you You can look it up yourself. Look it up yourself somewhere. So here we go. 3 of the other 4 queens are in the top 6 of the longest ruling English monarchs in history. And that's the current queen, Elizabeth II, the longest ruling monarch in British history, Victoria at 63 years, 216 days, and then Elizabeth I at 44 years, 127 days. This is Elizabeth in later years, which are images that you don't usually see. She's very vain about her appearance. This is Victoria in her diamond jubilee, and the current queen coronation portrait on the left, and her first time on the cover of Vogue, having been on the throne for 70 years. They've all been addressed in film or television. Maybe Elizabeth I, the most, although it's a tight race between Elizabeth I, Victoria, and the current queen, I would say, and Queen Anne, only once, but fairly recently in the movie The Favorite, for which Olivia Colman won an Oscar. We have more images of Elizabeth I than any other monarch prior to the age of photography. And Victoria, the first queen on the throne, and I don't know why this doesn't want to advance. There we go. How'd I get to Mary? Victoria, the first queen on the throne in the age of photography. A huge number of both photographic images and painted and printed, printed images. They all come from dysfunctional families. Mary and Elizabeth bastardized repeatedly all of their father's marital misadventures. Their father was Henry VIII. Anne split from her father in the Glorious Revolution. She hated her brother-in-law, William III, whom she succeeded on the throne. One of her nicknames for him was the Dutch Abortion. Victoria had an overbearing mother who had an overbearing, what should we call Sir John Conroy, valet, advisor, head of household. And then, of course, she also was kind of affected by all of the dysfunction of the various children of George III. The current queen, her uncle's abdication, Edward VIII's abdication, which made her father king, which everyone, including himself, thought he wasn't suited to do, and which the Queen Mum always blamed for his death, and then the rather tragic life of her sister, Princess Margaret, and now all the divorces of her children. 4 of these queens I'm talking about were never expected to be queen. And that's this trio right here. Elizabeth and the current queen was third in line to the throne for a long time. Mary, as I said, was 35 when she came to the throne. Elizabeth was 25. I never would have won. Anyway, Elizabeth was 25, and you can see her ideas on marriage here. Elizabeth never married. That's the one thing that's really amazing about Elizabeth, is not only is she on the throne for almost 45 years as a woman, but unmarried and childless. Anne was 42 when she came to the throne. Here she is with her husband, George of Denmark, and Elizabeth II, 26 when she came to the throne. Somehow I've gotten from accession to marriage. Anyway, Mary I they were all married to foreign royalty. Mary I was married to Philip II of Spain. Elizabeth not married, whether by design or by accident. Anne, Prince George of Denmark. Victoria, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and the current queen, Philip Mountbatten. That's an anglicization of Schlossberg. His father was the King of Greece at some point. Detractors from the monarchy used to refer to him as Phil the Greek. So here's Elizabeth's coronation portrait when she was 25. That's Anne's coronation portrait at 42, Victoria's at 18, and the current queen at the current queen at 25. Two of these queens had a huge number of children, or attempted to have a huge number of children. This is Victoria's, and Julie, I've seen 9 children in some places and 10 children in others.
9 is correct.
9 is correct. Okay. The current queen and her family. This is Queen Anne and her only child who survived infancy, George, the Duke of Gloucester. Anne was pregnant 17 times that we know of, one of which was a hysterical pregnancy, which, by the way, Mary I suffered from. Only 5 of her children were born alive. The Duke of Gloucester lived until he was 11 and contracted smallpox at his birthday party, and died, leaving no heir to the throne. The current queen has the longest marriage of any member of English royalty. I wanted to tell you something about some of their interests. Elizabeth I had an interest in music. You see here, she played the lute and whatever that musical instrument is at the top that belonged to her. She could play songs that her father wrote, songs that her stepmother, Catherine Parr, wrote, and she liked to dance, as you can see there on the left. That's her and Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, dancing. Queen Anne was a patron of Georg Friedrich Handel, thankfully for all of us. Victoria and Albert both played the piano. They often played duets together. And on the left, you see Song Without Words, which is a duet that they often played. And then the current queen at the piano and with her sister, the Princess Margaret. The current queen is rather fond of show tunes, I understand, in music. A love for dogs and horses run through these royal women. That's the current queen on the left. That's Elizabeth I on the right. 2 years before Elizabeth I died, she was still riding 10 miles a day. This is Victoria on the right. She took up horseback riding after her husband died. And on the left with a dog who she, her was Dash, was he her first one, Julie, or one of her first ones, who she had for many years and was rather fond of. And then the current queen and her corgis. Her corgis, of course. 2 of these women are known for being rather snappy dressers. This is the current queen in her rainbow-colored wardrobe, that especially in later years. And then, of course, Elizabeth and all the fantastic, symbolic, heavily jeweled gowns that she wore. Elizabeth I was quite the needlewoman. On the left is the cover of a prayer book that she embroidered for her stepmother, Catherine Parr, whose initials you can see in the middle. The current queen, having been an ambulance driver in the Second World War. They all ruled over wars of various sorts. This is the so-called Armada portrait of Elizabeth I after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. They were all involved with the British Empire in some way. And we can probably credit Elizabeth I with getting the British Empire off the ground. This is Victoria as Empress of India, which was probably the height of the British Empire, and the current queen in front of the flags of the Commonwealth, the successor of the empire that she has been very, very dedicated to. 2 of these women died with no direct heirs to the throne and were succeeded by male cousins, Elizabeth I and Anne. 2 of these women had heirs that were old men when they died or when they will die. This is Victoria on the right and her son, Edward VII, who succeeded her on the left, and the current queen and the current Prince Charles. Edward was 57 when his mother died. Charles is 73 already. And his mother still with us. Anne was the last monarch to veto an act of parliament. She was the last monarch to touch for the Queen's evil, the skin condition that English monarchs were supposed to be able to cure due to their direct connection with God. Anne sat on the throne not only as a woman, but as an invalid. She suffered from gout and several other autoimmune diseases. Victoria is the great-great-grandmother of the current queen. Both of them had marriages that were love matches, husbands who were strong supporters of them on the throne and good fathers. Both of these women present and active monarchs during their reigns. Anne and Elizabeth I had to deal with deathbed harangues from male ministers. Elizabeth having survived all the machinations of her father's reign, and Anne surviving revolution to sit on the throne herself. This is Elizabeth on the right, Victoria on the left. Elizabeth I has been an avatar, a model for all of the women on the throne who came after her. This is from the TV series Victoria, and if you see here in the circle in the background, that's the coronation portrait of Elizabeth I, which according to the show hung in the room where Victoria sat at her desk and attended to her tasks as queen. She's also been a model for the current queen, although the current queen claims to not be named after her. And I guess the queen mum was Elizabeth too, wasn't she? So then just a couple of things about Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II. Elizabeth I set up as a model for this queen. They are related through that common ancestor, either 13th or 14th cousins, depending on who you ask. Both have had very long reigns, maybe too long, both of them leaving succession issues. I think arguably, both of them ascended at the age of 25, so on the throne for a long time. Neither of them expected to be queen because both were third in line to the throne. Neither had a full-blooded brother. Elizabeth I had a half-brother, and these two women presiding over English culture from Shakespeare to the Beatles. So arguably having had a lot of effect on England, Britain, and Anglo-Saxon culture around the globe. And then I know Julie and Anne are going to talk more about this. The current queen and the immediate succession to the throne, her son Charles, his son William, his son George, and then just a graphic of the line of succession further on to the throne. The English always get really anxious about transition from one monarch to another, about succession. The English are very keen to have what they call a surety in the succession. And Julie and Anne will probably address this as well, but is there a surety to the succession with the current queen? I think is a question that a lot of people have. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Julie.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Barron. Let me get my images. Going ahead. All right, so I want to start. I obviously, as Elizabeth II, when she had her coronation, the media all hailed that this would be a second Elizabethan age, or at least they hoped it would be. And there were times when she seemed to fulfill the promise and other times when she faced quite a bit of criticism. Okay, so this is well before the time of all of us, but October 1957, Queen Elizabeth and her husband Philip actually made it a trip. They were going to DC. They were also going to Canada, and she wanted to see a typical American sport. And so she got to witness the Terps defeat the North Carolina Tar Heels 21-7. And for any of you who have been in McKeldin Library, which I'm assuming is all of you, if you go into the cafe first, on the wall opposite the cafe is a photograph of the Queen surrounded by these big football players. It's really quite wonderful. There's something that she said one time. She said, "I must be seen to be believed." And I think that's really important about how she viewed the role of a modern monarch after World War II, in the television age, and now she's a queen who's on Twitter as well. But it was very important to be out there. And if we go back centuries, this was not really the attitude of monarchs. But by the 18th century, with the age of newspapers, this new media, the newspapers and public opinion were mattering more and more. There would be cartoons and caricatures undermining the power of the monarchs. And so monarchs needed to cater to public opinion. Victoria, of course, lives through the time of tabloids, and she'll often be the subject of a lot of scrutiny and ridicule. And so it is important to be seen to be believed. Now, Dr. showed you the cover of Vogue magazine. This queen has been on the cover of Time magazine before she was queen, when she was a little princess. So multiple covers. She's often seen to be believed. Dr. Barron mentioned the abdication. So her uncle, Edward, who gave up the throne for Wallace Simpson in 1936, in the midst of the Great Depression, as well as the rise of fascism on the continent, the Spanish Civil War. This couple, they were known to have friends who had Nazi sympathies. So there wasn't really a lot of love for them from the general public. But this photograph then is a wonderful image that then shows his brother, who didn't expect to be king, George VI. So they're on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. His wife, Elizabeth, who will be Queen Mum once the Princess becomes queen after her father dies in 1952. So with this abdication in 1936, this young princess knows that she will have a turn on the throne. Okay, now, if you've been paying attention, obviously, in recent years, there's been a lot of nostalgia for the early years of the British monarchy, with Brexit, going back to the glory days when Britain was great, and then the pandemic. There's been a longing, a lot of nostalgia for the past. And this current queen gave an address to the nation where she hearkened back to the World War II spirit. When people pulled together, they did their bit and they got through it. And she said, we can do that again in this pandemic. Now, a lot of people, of course, may not have a memory of this, but it's become part of the cultural consciousness of the role that the royal family played in World War II. And it helped to seal the public's affection for generations. Now, as princesses, she and her sister Margaret were evacuated to Windsor Castle. So a lot of children were evacuated to homes and farms in the countryside. And she could talk about how she shared that experience. Of course, not everyone gets evacuated to a castle. But then when she was 18, she begged her father to allow her to join the women's branch of the army, the ATS. She was actually a mechanic, and she drove trucks, something that until recently, she still loved to do, to drive her own big cars. Here is the image from her coronation day, June 2nd, 1953. So although her father died in 52, February 6th, the coronation was delayed because you have to allow an appropriate length of time for the monarch to pass before you hold such a festival. So when she dies, I'm assuming that Charles will also, there will be a short break before his coronation. Okay, just for a second, let's just watch the moment where we all say, God save the Queen. Okay, so that coronation was the first to be aired on television. It was a really brilliant thing to do. It was the first time BBC cameras were allowed inside Westminster Abbey. Here is a nice middle-class family watching the coronation on TV. People around the world watched this. And she and her husband, as royals, part of this new Elizabethan age, became associated more and more with modernity. How were they going to rebuild the nation after World War II, with all of the physical destruction to cities, the loss of life. Rationing didn't end until 1952 in Britain. So there was a lot of hope for this new Elizabethan age with this young modern couple. All right. Here we see, okay, this is like Victoria. Now, Victoria was 18, not yet married. She marries after she's queen and then has 9 children. We get a monarch in 1952 who already is a wife and a mother. And there she is. She's going to be able to juggle a baby, her handbag, and her duties on the throne. Now, it's not always easy to be the male royal consort. Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, he struggled with that in the Victorian age, which was a very patriarchal age. A man's home was his castle, and yet who ruled over the castle was his wife. Philip sometimes felt the same way. I'm the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children. He said, I'm nothing but a damn amoeba. So he did sometimes resent the fact that he would never be king when his wife died. Okay, this image of ordinariness, which I think is so important, always being photographed with the family. Victoria actually created what was called the Royal Family Album. You can purchase photographs of the royal family, or now you can follow them on Instagram. But the question is really, how ordinary are they? Now, she tries to rebrand the monarchy because there are times when she gets criticized for being a little too stuffy, a little too priggish. So she realized then she had to step it up a notch. And since the 1960s, she would deliver her annual Christmas broadcast on live TV without teleprompters to appear more natural. She was pregnant, heavily pregnant at the time when the Beatles gave a special performance. So the Queen Mom and her sister Princess Margaret met the Beatles for her. But as an older queen, she got to meet the Spice Girls. And if you were familiar with when London hosted the Olympics, and there was this whole joke with James Bond parachuting with the Queen, she does have a sense of humor, but all of these things are to show, that she's kind of with it. She's modern. She can keep up with the times. This was one of her previous Jubilees where she does walk. She gets out when, now she may not be able to. And she meets, of course, her subjects, her constituents. Doing this thing called the walkabout when she was touring in Australia. She got out of the car and strolled, and this helps to really seal the public's affection, being very accessible, being seen to be believed. She also plays a role as consoler. If you watch The Crown, you're familiar with that horrible avalanche that buried the school children and teachers in this little village town, a mining town in Wales. And she, had to go and comfort. She got criticized for not going immediately. After the Manchester bombing, right, with the Ariana Grande concert, there she is visiting victims of the bombing. This is a very important role that she and her children play as part of their charitable duties. Here she was at her Silver Jubilee, 25 years on the throne when Britain was in the midst of a terrible global recession. For those of you who like punk music, the Sex Pistols wrote their own version of God Save the Queen and protested the Jubilee. Still a fantastic song. Is it always appropriate to have these big celebrations of monarchy, which some people find to be a waste of money, especially in times of crisis for the nation? Others believe it's like a tonic to the nation. It's the thing that will cheer us up and pump in money through tourism. Of course, this royal family has been subjected to scrutiny by the tabloids in ways which we never really saw in the past. The tabloids can make the royal celebrities, but it can also destroy them as well. Now, this queen, her children, of course, have been subject to the most tabloid coverage, with the son and heir Charles and his disastrous marriage that starts as a fairy tale. And then, of course, because of his ongoing affair with Camilla, who is now his wife, and then Diana's death and that Paris tunnel, it really sealed the public's affection for Diana, who becomes almost canonized as a saint and England's rose, the people's princess. So these are moments when the royals, like the Queen, are not so well loved. They resent the way in which some members of the royal family can sort of be eaten alive. Okay, and so the public wanted the Queen to come and address the nation that she cares. Now, so hopefully, you'll remember this was only a few years ago when Harry, who is not next in line, he doesn't really have to worry, when he married the American actress Meghan Markle, and all, of course, the racist abuse she faced, some from within some members of the royal family, but obviously on social media with all the racist trolls. There were those who hoped that this would be a modern marriage that would take the royal family into the future. The Brexit vote had been 2 years before, and it had been fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment. And so some hoped that this would be like a healing balm to the nation. Unfortunately, less than 2 years later, Harry and Meghan, of course, gave up some of their titles and duties and left the country in what the media called Megxit. The Queen has had a lot of scandal. Most recently, of course, her son Andrew, who lost his royal titles because of his ties to the sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. So she's had to find a way to still keep the public's affection intact for the monarchy. Now, the Jubilee has been going on since February. There are events planned throughout the year, and a lot of the big events will be this summer in June. This is a great way for a lot of marketing tie-ins. We see how Victoria did it. Housewives get their stove polished with the Queen's image on it. And there will be a lot of marketing, of course, for this Jubilee as well. You can get a can of tea or you can get a little statuette. We consume royals in many ways. We also watch fictional representations of them on screen, whether it's The Crown or movies. So it's not quite clear which version we're supposed to believe. The royals put out their version, the media, the tabloids, and then, of course, pop culture. So how ordinary are they? They definitely want to cultivate this image and be seen and believed. But at the end of the day, they're not ordinary. The Queen, like then Charles, they are the anointed one. She is the head of state of the military, the Church of England, and when she dies, that royal breath will enter that of her successor, Charles. The announcement will be made to the Prime Minister, London Bridge is down, and then 10 days of mourning when the day comes when she dies, until her body will be interred at the Royal Vault at Windsor Castle. Now, there are some who are concerned that this last tie to the imperial past of Britain will now be severed, and what will await the royals in the future. Can Charles at 73, who's never really been that loved by the public, will he be able to assume those royal duties? Or will people, resent him because the shadow of Diana will always be there? We don't know. Polls up until recently have shown that 18% of Britons want a republic. So overwhelmingly, British people want to keep a constitutional monarchy. It is what makes them distinct. It's their ties to the past. That number, of course, is higher when you ask young people. Back in 1962, Shirley Smith, ice cream seller, said, having a queen makes it seem as if we're all part of a family. But more and more, we've seen that this has been a dysfunctional family. The United Kingdom is more and more disunited. And so it will be a lot of work for the next royals to sort of rebuild the nation and keep up the affection for royalty as an institution. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Dr. Barron. I'm sorry, to Dr. Rush.
All right, everyone, let me just get this up, slideshow. I'm not sure why we're doing that. Okay, all right, so the British Empire, I think Dr. Barron mentioned that you can blame Elizabeth I or credit her with starting the British Empire, which is pretty much true. In 1584, she actually sponsored an exploratory voyage by Sir Walter Raleigh to the eastern coast of the United States, or no, back then, North America, sorry, would become the United States. And it eventually granted him a charter to colonize what we now know as Virginia, which of course was named for Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen. This is the first Elizabeth, of course. So Raleigh did in fact start a colony. It failed, but the next 350 years, the British Empire grew and it grew and it grew. It came to encompass over 14 million square miles, bringing the British monarchy about 500 million people to rule over in its height. It's a quarter of the world's population. There's subjects in this is a map from 2015, which is about the height of the empire when it was at its largest. And you basically have anywhere from 80 to 100 territories. Some of them are colonies, some of them are protectorates. You've got all different kinds of ways of being associated with Britain. But this is a large number, and all the pink bits on this map are indeed showing you the parts of the British Empire. So from that point on, all the monarchs after Elizabeth, of course, were ruling over the empire as well as over British itself. And so they had to engage with the empire, just as they do with their regular people in Britain, regular people. So the empire people also engaged with their monarch. And this is really the point of what I want to focus on here, a little bit about the reaction to monarchy, particularly from the empire. So if you look at the slide, of course, I've got a very young image of Victoria. It's the year after, painted the year after she became queen. As you know, she was very young. And she started with the role of the monarch, particularly in the empire, became increasingly important during her reign. Some of this is deliberate, it's sort of a PR campaign on the part of the British government, particularly in the late part of her reign. But a lot of it had to do with timing, and particularly the success of it, because she became head of state in 1837. And in 1833, Parliament had actually passed the Emancipation Act, which was the act that freed all the people that were enslaved in the British Empire. And this basically gave them it happened before her reign, but if you know anything about this act, and I know my students do, the Emancipation Act actually on the ground, it took 4 to 6 years for the people who were enslaved to be able to leave their former master. They had to continue working on the plantations or in the domestic situations, many different ways that they served as slaves. They had to continue working for a number of years. So she came to power right in the middle of the point where people were actually being able to leave, say the plantation or somewhere else. So particularly in colonies where there were people that were enslaved, she was seen by many of them as an emancipator, as part of this whole process of freeing and making people of the empire, the subjects of the empire, actually all liberated and free people. And this became an important part of her image, not just in places in the empire, particularly like the Caribbean, where there had been many, many slaves, but also in other parts of the empire. And so you can see she became very beloved. This is actually in the late 1800s. It's a ceremony to install a statue of Victoria in Victoria Park in Kingston, Jamaica. And these statues, there were so many statues of Victoria installed of the empire during the course of her reign, and particularly in the later part of it. It's also things like her, people like missionaries, people like preachers, teachers, government officials, all kinds of people encouraged a sort of gratitude to Victoria in their sermons, in their speeches, when you went to school. You would, particularly in the late 1800s, where free elementary schools were starting in Britain itself as well, but in many parts of the empire, ordinary people, poor people would go in and they'd see a picture of Victoria, they'd see the British flag. This would all be associated for them together. And these colonial Britons of all kinds, Black people, white people, Asian people, rich, poor, middle-class men, women, children in the empire, all showed up for this they all heard this. And as her reign was coming to an end and you're moving into the 20th century, and I will move us along a little bit here. This is actually her Diamond Jubilee celebration in 1897. And this is just to show you, yes, there was a Jubilee parade for her in London, an enormous thing, to which were invited people from all over the empire. And I'm not just talking heads of state or representatives, official representatives, Boy Scouts troops, Girl Scout troops, various kinds of organizations were invited to come and came and would continue to come in other Jubilee celebrations and things like coronation celebrations for the British royals in the early part of the 20th century. So this is in Melbourne, Australia. This is the Indian contingent, people, of course, marching in the parade from India. Barbados celebrating with a stamp of her Jubilee. But and they're very involved in these celebrations. One of the things about the celebrations that continue throughout the 20th century is that the people of the empire helped organize, they participated, they are heavily involved in all of this. And this celebration of royalty becomes part of, in a sense, a way of life for many of them. Even at Victoria's death in 1901, they showed out in huge numbers to go to funerals and honoring services all over the empire. And in fact, a writer in Barbados, Austin Clarke, said in the 1940s when he was a child, one of his poor elderly neighbors, and she happened to be a woman of color, showed him a silver shilling that she had saved as a remembrance of the funeral of Queen Victoria. In fact, she had saved a shilling, which was worth quite a lot of money in those days, and she could have used it for something else, but she saved it because it mattered to her, which was really interesting. The empire, of course, we've already seen a lot. Dr. Taddeo is about her family and the beginning of this idea of the royal family being part of the empire does come in many senses from Victoria. You see here with 4 generations of her family. Her son, Edward VII, who, as we talked about already, was an old man by the time he got to be king, which, you know, because she lived so long. Her grandson, George V, and her great-grandson, George VI, her son, George V, her great-grandson, George V. I'm getting my grapes mixed up. Apologies for that. Anyway, there's 4 generations of royal family here. The little boy you see in here, it's interesting. That is Edward VIII. He was the guy who actually was sort of the unking. He actually, his father died. He was going to be king, but he abdicated. Dr. Taddeo mentioned this in the slide. And this is sort of a certain shakiness in empire. But one of the interesting things about it is when he did abdicate, people in the empire debated it, talked about whether or not this was a good thing, he giving up his throne for someone else, but they were very engaged in it, writing letters to the paper. It's really very interesting. The empire becomes a commonwealth, and we've mentioned that several times. And I wanted to talk briefly about how that happens, because the British monarch is completely in the center of this thing. Basically, in 1931, a law is passed by the British Parliament, which establishes this commonwealth. And it is designed as a way to sort of deal with this sort of huge empire that the British government knows they're not really going to maintain in its present form. There's going to be no way. They've already got various countries in the empire, such as Canada, New Zealand, etc., pretty much running themselves. And they know they're going to have to do this with more of them. India's been agitating this for years by 1931, for example. So they create this process of making countries who want to become independent, they become members of the Commonwealth. Originally, the Commonwealth started off with all of those who were basically running themselves already. You can see the list up here. But the interesting part about this is the only legal tie that was going to remain between these countries and the Commonwealth was going to be the Queen or the King, depending on who was ruling at the time. It was the British monarch. When it was first established, you see George V here, the guy in all the ornate jewelry, shall we say, here. And he indeed is the first king of the Commonwealth. It then passes down to his son and eventually to Queen Elizabeth II when she becomes the queen. And the interesting thing about this, the Commonwealth was designed to be an equal partnership among the various nations that belong to it. So they kept the queen, but the queen or the king, sorry, it's been the queen for so long, you sort of forget. You have this very interesting thing in which they are each individually autonomous, completely autonomous, but this monarch is the separate monarch for each of these countries. And so they don't have to pay attention to the rules and laws of Britain or any other member of the Commonwealth. They have their own. But the central tie here is the monarch of Britain. The progress of decolonization, as they kind of expected, I think, when you look at 1931 and what they put together, even though historians have debated this, went pretty quickly. 1947, India and Pakistan become members of the Commonwealth and 2 independent countries. And all of these different countries, you can see the progress of decolonization. It goes right down to 1997 when Hong Kong was returned to China. This worked, but the Queen remains. Now, just to a point, let me just bring up the coronation ceremonies around Elizabeth II in 1953. These are images from those ceremonies. And the coronation, I want to make the point that the coronation happened in London, but it was celebrated again all the way around the world. You can see on the bottom left, this is in fact people in New Zealand who showed up to view the coronation celebrations. There were, as Dr. Taddeo mentioned, all kinds of things being sold. This is a matchbook in New Zealand. You also see in Antigua in the Caribbean, and in the top right-hand corner, a schoolgirl who is dressed up as Britannia, which is one of the symbols of the British Empire. All of this to celebrate the Queen's her coronation in 1953. So she remains, of course, for a very long time, as we already know. But as Dr. Taddeo mentioned, in recent years, there has been some concern. Now, the Queen only remained there have been choices made. For example, when countries became independent, they could choose whether or not to be part of the Commonwealth. Many chose not to. Quite a few chose to. Today, we have 54 countries that are in the British Commonwealth, having chosen to be there. Only 15 of them have chosen to keep the Queen as their head of state, in other words, as their Queen, but she's still the head of the Commonwealth. So they all have that sort of tie to her. In those 54 countries, we have a few even that have joined that were never part of the British Empire, which always sort of puzzles me a little, but that does happen. And one of the things that, and this is actually a list, you can go to the Commonwealth site and find out more about the Commonwealth. There are also British territories overseas, as you can see here in this final slide. And I don't have the slide. Dr. Taddeo very kindly provided one for me of the most recent royal tour that took place with just recently, in fact, with the current heir to the throne, William, and his wife. And they, of course, this has been termed in the press recently as a failed royal tour because people are not so happy now. The Queen is 95 years old. She's been beloved. I get the feeling that many countries are sort of waiting around, have been maybe not really thinking about it, waiting around for her to go before they in fact decide to also become republics and not remain in the members of with the Queen as their head of state, shall I put it. So I'm going to stop there because I've probably gone too long and open it up for questions.
All right, so Jessica, why don't you pose one question to each of us? And meanwhile, anyone in the audience, if you want to put your questions in the chat, Jessica will then field them.
All right, well, thank you to all three of you for those fun little presentations. I feel like I was getting a little lecture from each of you. It was very nice. So I will turn to Dr. Barron first. So you were talking a lot about each of the 4 queens that we've seen on the throne in England. And I was wondering, what are some challenges that have arisen and that are specific to those queens? So the challenges of being a queen versus a king, and then how have the challenges changed from the first Elizabeth to the Elizabeth we have on the throne today?
Thanks. Well, the biggest challenge is being a queen. As I said, I think, these are women who encumber an office that is by definition male. And we can talk about modernity in the late 20th century, but, a lot of the criticism of the current queen has been gender-based and remains gender-based. So what they've all had to face, and the earlier ones especially, under English common law, wives are subsumed in their husband's person, and wives have no rights under English common law, period. so the problem for these women is if they, and this is a real problem for Elizabeth I, if they get married, they might be the ruler of the realm, but legally they're subordinate to their husband. So how does that work? And that, fed all the paranoia about these women marrying foreigners, marrying royals from outside England, which they had to do because there's nobody in England of equivalent rank for them to marry. So I think the gender challenge is the biggest. And you want to talk about life work balance for these women, wives and mothers, and then all the business of kingdom and empire and commonwealth on top of that. And again, with some of the earlier ones, although this queen probably experiences it as well, is constantly being nattered at by their male advisors. You go bake cookies and take care of the kitty wings and let the boys handle it all. And that was a real problem. Elizabeth I, be careful how even you try the patience of your prince, she said. And some of them being manipulated not just by political males, but by males in their family and males they were married to as well. And how much it's changed, if you can't tell, not all that much.
Yeah, I think kind of attaching this to Dr. Taddeo, your presentation, the issue of family, especially as a woman who is a queen, and also you are the mother of a family, and like you saw in that quote, the mother of the country in some ways. And you also mentioned how the power of Elizabeth and the queens who came before her came from the public's viewing of them. And I wonder, do you think possibly we see too much of the queen now? And how do you think that portrayal of her in shows like The Crown, where I know most of my friends saw that show and now have a completely different perspective on her and the royal family and all the drama that came around her and her family. So do you think we know too much about them now? Or do you think that we know so much because we love them so much and we just want to get more and more information from them?
Interesting question. I don't think we know too much about them. I think we know too much. Now, we have to remember there are royal biographers, then there's unauthorized biographies, then there's the tabloids, then the royal court circular that the royal family puts out, and then of course there's social media where everybody can weigh in. So there's so many narratives that we don't really know the whole truth. Now, of course, our royals have like multiple bodies. They have the royal body, their private body. The public seems to think that we have a right to know. And I think, to echo Dr. Barron, the scrutiny of female monarchs in particular has been brutal. And Victoria faced that as a young woman. She wanted to stay single. She was pressured to marry. Fortunately, she married a guy who she thought was hot and, she liked sex with him. But even he became too controlling. Now we theorize that he kept her pregnant all the time because even the queen doesn't have access to birth control, so that he could assume duties. And then when she didn't behave, all these rumors would be circulated by the media that she was having an affair when she was single with the prime minister. Then when she was a widow, that she had an affair. That picture that Dr. Barron brought up of Victoria on the horse, the man next to it is her servant, John Brown, and rumors spread about them. So female monarchs in particular are subject to scrutiny, surveillance. They have to follow certain norms of behavior like everyone else and be role models to the nation. It's a lot to expect of them. Now, it's interesting about The Crown. We all know it's historical fiction. The first few seasons, it was reported that the queen liked the show. Yes, because she got to see herself being presented as a young woman and the challenges. The last season, which showed Charles in such a negative light, really being pretty much abusive to young Diana, then there was criticism and they were demanding that Netflix issue the disclaimer that it was fiction. I think that pressure came from Charles. I don't think it came from the queen so much. So I don't think that everyone loves them. Obviously, Americans, we have this weird relationship. Whenever there's a royal event, it's covered on all the morning news shows. And we will plan our tourist trips around the weddings and maybe, even the funerals, the coronations. So, the royals are big, but I think being a female monarch too is really tricky to navigate.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rush. My final question is for you.
Okay.
So obviously, as Dr. Taddeo has mentioned, there has been a lot of controversy, and there's been controversy both in this Queen Elizabeth's lives, but also in previous Queen's lives. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the specific controversies like the abdication of Edward and how that kind of led to this current Queen, and other controversies in the past that have circulated these queens that we all admire and look up to.
Okay, well, with the abdication, it's often seen as something that just happened within Britain because it was a very personal thing. I mean, Edward the eighth, or that he would have been Edward the eighth if he had remained king. He wanted to marry somebody he'd fallen in love with, who had happened to be American, which was a big strike, and also she had been divorced. And this was the real problem. This was the real problem. And so basically, the English government, it said, you can't marry this woman because she's a divorcee. It wasn't really because she was American. Yeah, it was because she was a divorcee and still remain king. And so many people thought that he would choose just to be king and give her up. He didn't. He decided to go with marrying her, and he abdicated the throne. And it's very interesting because the empire, they actually had to do, the government actually told people, the prime minister at the time, Baldwin, actually received information from the various heads of state in the dominions, which were the first members of the Commonwealth, but they also heard from in letters in various parts of the empire. People wrote in, and I mean, they were fighting about it. They're like all for, this is a love match and should be allowed, and he should be able to be king, to, oh, he gave up, he's not doing his duty. You saw this scandal, so this disruption. And I looked at it really closely in Jamaica, and what it seemed to be is Edward the Eighth was seen as a very modern kind of person, and a lot of people supported him, but they also supported the idea of him having his independence. And that became sort of a theme that although people still wanted to have the monarch as their monarch, in Jamaica, indeed, until very recently, has had the Queen as the monarch. They still do, but they're talking about getting rid of her now. But they basically were saying, well, if he can become independent, why can't we become independent of our duties to the empire? So you have that going on. You have all kinds of scandal, and the empire weighs in on it. The people in the colonies weigh in on it. All kinds of people that you wouldn't expect to be interested at all weigh in on this stuff.
And I think we're seeing that again now with, as you mentioned, the Kate and William extravaganza in the Caribbean, and how that is kind of being tied back to Elizabeth and her crown and her eventual ending of her throne.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have 2 or 3 questions in the chat, I believe. The first 2 are just general questions. So any of you 3, if you feel the need to answer, please feel free to do so. And then we have 1 question directed for Dr. Barron. So the first question is, regardless of how long they were on the throne, which queen would you 3 say had the biggest impact on how we currently view the monarchy?
Now, maybe Dr. Barron will disagree. I would say Victoria, honestly. I think that she was a true, she's a queen in the industrial age, mass production of everything. She's mass producing her image for everybody. She too was pretty much represented the philosophy of having to be seen to be believed. She's always out there for public events. And she understood that a female monarch in a patriarchal age, and that's the same thing in 1953, a very patriarchal post-war age, has to be a wife and a mother and be ordinary. She created fashions for middle-class housewives, and she catered to their values. And I think this current queen did the same thing. And when the royal family had a documentary made about themselves, which was it had a lot of complications, but in part of that documentary, Queen Elizabeth is deliberately shown reading Queen Victoria, her great-great-grandmother's diary. She wanted to show her association with that past and that she was her role model. I feel it's Victoria.
Well, as Julie so rightly says, there are several different measurements, right? And I think Julie thinks I'm going to argue for Elizabeth. I mean, I think what's so great about Elizabeth is that she does it as a single woman with no children. Which, Victoria had the support of Albert as long as he was around, and she had the whole, maternal image thing that benefited her that Elizabeth I didn't have. So I think that's what's remarkable about her. She was a crafty politician. She understood politics. She understood politics as the art of the possible, and she operated that way. That said, there were also a lot of issues in her reign that she just kicked down the road and blew up later on other people. But as long as she was around, she managed to keep the lid on. But almost 45 years, no husband, no children.
Go ahead, Dr. Rush.
I'm going to vote for Elizabeth II. You all both make a really good point, but because I'm coming from the imperial stance, I'm going to say, apart from the emancipator issue with Victoria, which is huge, and certainly without that, you would not have had the focus on the empire for many people. But as far as a modern monarch, Elizabeth II realized not only you have to be seen, but you have to be seen everywhere. She traveled all over the empire. These royal tours, she took herself everywhere, and she met many, not just regular people. I mean, fancy people. She met regular people. In Jamaica, she actually had a young man. He was a young man. He had young children. And he suddenly, as she was sort of doing her walk, waving to people and everything, he jumped in front of her, threw down his coat, and bowed to her, which was a play on Sir Walter Raleigh, who there's this myth that's how she and Sir Walter Raleigh met. The first Elizabeth met for Sir Walter Raleigh in this way, and he knew that story, and he had waited around. And when she actually came to Jamaica, the second Elizabeth, they called him the new Walter Raleigh in the papers. He also got arrested, by the way, but he was very soon after released when it became clear he wasn't crazy. He just really wanted to show his love for the Queen, and there's a lot of debate in the papers about that. But it's just the contact with ordinary people was something that she really got, and she knew she couldn't stay at home to do it. So that's good. She could get my vote.
By the way, the guy in Jamaica got off easy because the original Sir Walter Raleigh got his head chopped off. But anyway.
Well, yeah, there is that. He got out very easy. We have evolved in our punishments.
Okay. So next question is from Fatima, and this is actually a really interesting question. Do you all think Parliament will ever address the age question because Elizabeth is so old, similar to how they addressed the issues of religion and gender in the past, and how that will affect the monarchy? Or do you think because the Commonwealth and the monarchy has really lost its imperial power, that issue will not need to be addressed as much as the age, or not the age, the religion and the gender issues were?
So is the question meaning because she's so old that she should step aside instead of waiting till she dies?
I'm assuming that
Okay.
is, but if Fatima, if you're
Yeah.
still here and you want to clarify, please feel free to unmute.
Is she still with us? It's a great question. The Queen's mother lived to what, 101 or 102? So don't count her out. She survived COVID. Now, if we go back to like George III, he did finally step aside. He had a 60-year reign, right? He stepped aside for the Prince Regent, but that's because he was so incapacitated with ill health and his mental health. He was going blind. But this Queen is pretty much with it. So why should she? Honestly, when she dies, then her royal breath can enter Charles. And I know some people have said, well, Charles is old. Why doesn't he abdicate in favor of his son? Why would he? He has been waiting his whole life for this. So I don't know. I think she would really have to be infirm. Now, of course, she made a public appearance the other day and people raved about how she leaned on her son rather than use a wheelchair. Of course, that son was Prince Andrew, which was not such a good look given his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Use the wheelchair. But I don't know. I think as long as she is mentally with it, she would never step down despite her age.
So we did get some clarification. So this question was more talking about future monarchs, and if in going forward there should be a limit for the age of those monarchs.
I don't see that happening, but I could be wrong.
I mean, it's a good point, but I don't think it's going to be enough of an issue that they're going to worry about it. That would be my guess.
The age limits are kind of difficult to do. I mean, you know, my mother, who's 91 in a nursing home, just got summons for jury duty, and you wouldn't believe what I had to go through to convince them that she wasn't able to do that. So, you know, it's kind of hard because different people have different capacities at different age. But I will say, I'll relate this to gender, that it is difficult for women because when they get older, especially they get postmenopausal, it's difficult because of the way our culture historically relates to women, which is as a sex object. And that for Elizabeth I, that was a huge problem. And she, you know, they're painting portraits of her 2 years before she died, where she looks like this young, fresh-faced 18-year-old, simply because you know, the culture doesn't know how to engage with postmenopausal women. And she couldn't stay at home and hide because she was a public figure, the head of state. She had to be out. She had to be out in public. And so maybe we've gotten a little bit better than that in the first almost quarter of the 21st century. But I think that's, you know, that's still a problem. I dare say if you had a man her age on the throne, you wouldn't be hearing, you know, you wouldn't be hearing that. He'd be vigorous to the end, but that's me.
I agree. I will say, like, if you watch The Crown, there's a great episode where Elizabeth, she gives herself that matronly hairdo that she becomes known for. And her husband says, "Are you trying to not get pregnant again?" You know, as a joke, like it's a, but I do think that she did that deliberately. Not because she was threatened by Jackie Kennedy, as The Crown theorizes, but because I think she understood the importance as a woman to be taken seriously, to not be sexualized, to be, you know, a serious person. And then she sort of grew into that matronly image. And she has stuck with that hairdo and that style of dress to this day. I kind of feel that that was a shrewd move on her part.
And not to belabor this, but you know, the same thing about Elizabeth I, the way her image was manipulated, it was deliberately manipulated to keep her looking young. You know, it was kind of the complete obverse of what Julie just described. Yeah.
All right, our final question is directed to Dr. Barron, and it is, which of the queens that you discussed do you think developed most in their reign, and which of them grew in their role to be the queen most aptly?
Wow. Good question, tough to answer. Well, maybe I'll go about it the other way. I think probably the one who developed the least would be Anne, although I think she gets bad publicity, largely because she was a woman, largely because she was unwell, largely because she wasn't successful as a mother. Actually, she's often, you know, described as being stupid and all of these kinds of things, which, you know, when you get down in the weeds, is absolutely not the case. She wasn't doing what men wanted her to do, but that doesn't make her stupid. But they all, I mean, I think Elizabeth I, Victoria, the current queen, you know, just are all magnificent politicians, and more of a learning curve for some of them than others. I mean, Elizabeth I, by the time she comes to the throne, she's been bastardized, legitimized, bastardized, almost executed, the center of plots. You know, it's a miracle she lived to the age of 25, much less sit on the throne and be as successful as she was. And Victoria starts out so young, and coming out of such a repressive childhood and having to deal with a moody husband, you know, as well as all those prime ministers. She, you know, but I think, you know, by the end, most people would consider her to be a very successful monarch. And the current queen, I mean, just think about the changes she's had to face in the time she's been on the throne. I mean, it's just, you know, light speed developments, and it's very hard for an institution that has the kind of historical roots that monarchy has, I think, to adjust to those kinds of changes that are happening so rapidly.
Can I ask one question for the people who are left in the chat? Are any of you planning on doing one thing to commemorate the Jubilee, especially as we move to June, is when the big celebrations are? Special tea? Are you going to London? Does anyone have a plan? Or do you not care?
feel free to speak up directly.
Drink a ton of British tea, okay? For those of you who want something stronger, have a gin and tonic. Gonna watch it on TV, all right. We can all get nice fascinator hats and show off. I
Nice.
used to go to London.
Yeah,
Yes,
everybody
like
wants
backstage
to go to
between.
London. I've already got the commemorative tea tin.
I do as well.
I've-
TJ Maxx is selling them.
Already got that far.
All right, so Kyle, as president, do you want to close us out?
Thank you everyone for coming. I sent the link to our group me in the chat so everyone could join for information on future events, trivia nights, social hours. We have an event on the Ukraine planned for April 13th at noon. It'll be our third one. And we're planning to have a social hour probably in the week after. And
April
thank you
18th.
again to Jessica and to all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Thanks
Thank you
everybody
for
for
being
coming.
here.
Great turnout.